March 18, 1943. A wet dawn over the North Atlantic. Gray waves heaved like iron. Wind tore at canvas. Salt crusted on steel. Somewhere beneath that churning surface, German U-boats hunted in silence. Periscopes low, torpedo doors open, crews steady and cold. In a coastal operations room thousands of miles away, the air was warmer, but the mood was colder. Because the war at sea wasn't being decided by cannons or courage alone. It was being decided by a string of letters no one could read. And on that morning the men trying to read it were losing. He wasn't old enough to vote. He wasn't old enough to fight. But the war depended on his brain. A teenager sat under harsh fluorescent light, surrounded by officers with ribbons and mathematicians with tired eyes. His hands were ink-stained. His shoulders were narrow. His uniform still looked borrowed. And the terrifying truth is, he wasn't even supposed to be there. The code had a name only a few dared to say out loud. Not because it was mystical, but because it was murderous. It came in bursts of radio static, punched out as cold dots and dashes, then turned into printed groups of letters that meant nothing. On paper it looked harmless. Like nonsense. At sea it was a death sentence. Convoys, fat with fuel, ammunition and food, were vanishing into the Atlantic like ghosts. 1 week, 12 ships. Another week, 15. Sailors froze in black water under a moon that didn't care. The merchant marines did not die with fanfare. They died quietly, choking on oil and salt, staring at the lights of ships that couldn't stop to save them. Every hour the code stayed secret, more ships disappeared. Admirals demanded answers. Politicians demanded victory. Newspapers demanded hope. But the truth in that room was brutal and simple. The enemy was reading the ocean like a map. And the Allies were blind. On the wall, a chart showed convoy routes in red grease pencil. Beside it, black pins marked sinkings. The pins were multiplying. The line of the war was shifting, not on land but in water. A captain slammed his palm onto a table. We reroute, they're already there. We keep the course, we sail into them. How the hell do they know? No one answered. Because everyone knew the answer. The Germans weren't guessing. They were being told. In a separate building behind barbed wire and blackout curtains, the codebreakers fought their own battle, one of paper, pattern, and pressure. Machines clicked and whirred like restless insects. Operators leaned over keyboards with faces bleached by sleeplessness. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like fog. Coffee went cold untouched. This wasn't glory. This was attrition. Men and women tried combinations, tested assumptions, chased fragments. For every breakthrough the enemy changed something. For every hopeful lead, a new format appeared like a fresh lock. It wasn't just a code. It was a living weapon. And right now it was winning. That's when the teenager arrived. 17 years old. A civilian trainee fast-tracked into the war's hidden bloodstream. His name was Evan Hart. He came from a dockside town that smelled like coal and fish. His father had gone to sea and never returned. His mother folded ration coupons and said little. Evan had spent his childhood repairing radios with scavenged parts, listening to distant stations late at night, learning what static hid. He didn't have medals. He didn't have rank. He didn't even have permission. A clerical error, one stamped paper, one rushed signature, had sent him to the wrong building. It should have been corrected immediately. But war has a way of keeping mistakes that prove useful. They put him in the corner with a stack of intercepted traffic and a pencil. Don't touch the machines, a senior cryptanalyst warned without looking up. And don't talk unless spoken to. Evan nodded. He kept his eyes down. He did what he'd done his whole life. He listened. They needed soldiers. What they got was a teenager. The first week he was invisible. A shadow among giants. Officers strode past him like he was furniture. Analysts argued in clipped voices over charts and tables. The word U-boat floated through the room like a curse. He watched them work, disciplined, brilliant, exhausted. And he watched them fail. Not because they were weak. Because the enemy was ruthless. Each morning brought fresh intercepts, new message groups, new keys, new heartbreak. Convoys moved on schedules tightened by fuel and fear. Out there escorts, destroyers, corvettes, frigates, charged through waves on sonar pings and prayers, dropping depth charges into emptiness. Sometimes they hit steel. Often they hit nothing at all. The Atlantic was too big. The hunter was too quiet. And the code was too strong. Evan began copying message groups by hand just like they told him. Rows of letters. Columns of dates. Times. Call signs. And then he noticed something that didn't fit. A repetition. It was small, barely a wrinkle in the fabric of chaos. A phrase that showed up at the same time each day. Not the letters exactly, but the shape of them. The rhythm. He circled it. Then he found it again. And again. The next day he found 3 more. His heart quickened. Not triumph, fear. Because patterns in an enemy code didn't mean genius. They meant a human being on the other side making a human mistake. Evan carried the paper to the nearest desk. A man with thinning hair and tired eyes, Lieutenant Commander Hargreaves, was hunched over a chart, jaw clenched like he was chewing iron. "Sir," Evan said softly. No response. He tried again. "Sir, I think there's a repetition in the daily traffic." Hargreaves didn't look up. "Everything repeats," he muttered. "The Germans breathe too." Evan swallowed. "Not like this. It's scheduled." Hargreaves finally raised his eyes, sharp, annoyed, drowning in fatigue. He looked at the teenager like he was a misplaced package. "What are you, a messenger boy?" "A trainee, sir." "Then train," Hargreaves snapped. "And stop wasting time." The paper was pushed back without being read. Evan returned to his corner. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. But he didn't stop. What he saw wasn't brilliance. It was curiosity. And curiosity in war can be lethal. 2 nights later, the building stayed awake while the world slept. Rain tapped the windows. Blackout curtains sealed the room from the outside. The machines clicked on, relentless as if time itself had teeth. Evan sat alone at a table littered with scraps. A desk lamp made a small circle of light in the vastness. His hands trembled from too much caffeine and too little rest. He laid out the intercepts like pieces of a crime scene. Dates, times, formats. And then, like a crack in a wall, something shifted. He stopped looking at letters as letters. He started looking at them as behavior. A daily transmission. Same timing. Similar length. Same structure. A routine report. Routine was the enemy of perfect security. Evan penciled possibilities, weather, positioning, fuel status, contact reports. He flipped to a separate sheet, merchant convoy schedules. Known U-boat patrol patterns. A map marked with sinkings. His finger traced an invisible line. Then he froze. The repetition matched, not in letters, but in function. A standard phrase transmitted every day at the same time. A predictable chunk like a signature in a dark room. A foothold. The code didn't collapse. It blinked. Evan's breath caught. He looked around as if someone might arrest him for thinking. He gathered the pages and ran. Down corridors that smelled of smoke and wet wool. Past offices where men stared at walls. Past guards who didn't ask questions because everyone was tired of asking questions. He burst into Hargreaves' room without knocking. The commander's head snapped up. "What?" Evan dropped the papers onto the desk. "Please. Just look." Hargreaves stared, first at the teenager, then at the circles, the notes, the alignment of timing and structure. He didn't speak. His eyes narrowed. He leaned forward. Seconds stretched. Then Hargreaves reached for the phone. His voice was suddenly different. Not annoyed. Grim. "Give me section chief. Now." The next hours moved like a storm. Senior analysts gathered. Officers pressed in. Cigarettes were lit with shaking hands. The teenager was pushed to the side again, but this time no one told him to leave. A heavy-set section chief arrived, coat still damp from rain, eyes like stone. He listened in silence while Hargreaves spoke faster than he had in weeks. "This pattern, if he's right, it gives us a known starting point," Hargreaves said, tapping the paper. "A predictable phrase. A repeated structure. We can anchor the day's key." The chief stared at Evan. "You found this?" Evan swallowed. I noticed the timing, sir." The chief looked at the papers again, then at the machines. "Run it," he ordered. Operators moved. Rotors were set. Switches snapped. The machine's internal teeth began to bite at the problem. Minutes. Then a line of output printed, still mostly garbage but with something new in the middle. A recognizable word. Then another. A coordinate reference. A grid. And suddenly the room went silent in the most terrifying way. Because they weren't staring at letters anymore. They were staring at meaning. The section chief's voice dropped to a whisper. "God help us." On the paper, a patrol line. A concentration. A hunting ground. A place where U-boats were waiting. And a convoy was already sailing toward it. The war moved quickly when information moved first. Phones rang. Orders flew. Maps were redrawn in seconds. Naval staff officers leaned over charts, barking into receivers. "Divert the convoy south by 40 miles. No. Don't debate it, do it." At sea, destroyers adjusted course. Engines groaned. Waves smashed against bows. Sailors clung to rails, unaware they were being steered away from death by a teenager's pencil marks. In the depths, U-boats waited in disciplined silence. But the convoy didn't come. The hunters stared through periscopes at empty ocean. Torpedoes sat useless in tubes. Batteries drained. Men grew tense. Their prey had slipped away. The next day more intercepts came in. More patterns. More anchors. The enemy changed procedures. The enemy tightened security. The enemy fought back. But the Allies had something they hadn't had in months. A way-in. Not every message. Not every time. But enough. Enough to predict. Enough to avoid. Enough to strike. Soon, Allied air support was vectored to the right squares of ocean, long-range patrol bombers roaring over clouds, searchlights sweeping the waves, depth charges slamming down like thunder. Escort groups began to hunt with purpose instead of hope. The balance shifted inch by inch, convoy by convoy. Enemy losses rose. Allied losses fell. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Evan sat in his corner again. Older now, not in years but in weight. He never fired a weapon. But lives were saved because of him. Men with guns followed the path. Cleared by a boy with a pencil. And then the moral cost arrived. Because intelligence doesn't feel like victory. It feels like responsibility. On a bulletin board, a list of ships lost before the breakthrough stayed pinned like a memorial. Evan read the names again and again. Sometimes he stared until his eyes blurred. He wondered if he could have noticed sooner. If 1 day earlier, 1 hour earlier, could have changed the water into something other than a grave. At night he heard the machines in his head. He imagined men in dark water calling for help into the wind. In the operations room, officers praised the team. The section chief reported progress. Admirals nodded and demanded more. No one mentioned the teenager by name. Because secrecy was a chain. And praise was a leak. Hargreaves approached Evan one evening, voice low. "You did good work," he said. Evan didn't smile. "How many did we lose before it worked?" Hargreaves hesitated. That alone was an answer. "War doesn't give refunds," the commander said quietly. "Only lessons." Evan stared at the floor. "I didn't want to learn it like this." Hargreaves' face tightened. "None of us did." When the war ended, the world celebrated with parades and flags and speeches. Tanks rolled through streets. Fighter planes screamed overhead. Generals shook hands. Politicians smiled for cameras. But the people behind the curtain, those who fought with paper and silence, returned to normal life like ghosts. Evan went home to a town that hadn't changed. Same docks. Same smell of coal and fish. Same cold wind. His mother hugged him like she'd been holding her breath for years. "What did you do?" she asked softly. He looked past her to the sea. "Nothing I can talk about." And that was the truth. His work remained classified. His impact remained hidden. His name stayed buried under the word, secret. The war moved on. History moved on. His secret stayed buried. Years later, books would celebrate admirals and aces and armored breakthroughs, front lines, artillery barrages, encirclements, desperate charges under fire. But few would speak about the teenager in the corner who changed a battle no one could see. Because the most decisive leaders aren't always the ones with pistols and maps. Sometimes the decisive leader is a boy who refuses to stop noticing. Sometimes authority doesn't validate with applause. It validates with action. It validates when fleets reroute. When escorts strike. When convoys arrive. When sailors step onto docks alive and never know why. In the end, Evan Hart didn't win the war alone. No one does. The Atlantic was held by desperate men. Escorts charging into storms, air crews sweeping endless gray, engineers keeping engines alive, captains keeping formation under the threat of sudden fire. But in impossible odds, against an enemy that seemed unbeatable, one decisive mind created a breach. A boy who didn't belong. A mistake the war decided to keep. And the question remains, sharp as winter wind. Was he a hero, or just a tool of war? Should children ever carry adult wars? How many wars were shaped by people we never learned about? He was too young for war. But war wasn't too big for him.